Hi, and welcome back to Random Scottish History. For Halloween this year, I thought we would investigate cannibalism in Scottish history and get into some of the historical documentation of anthropophagi, or cannibals, doing what they did within our country. There's a lot to get through, so we'll just get on with it. I don't want to draw this out too long for you. So we'll start with a bit of text from J.P. Maclean's A Manual on the Antiquity of Man, published 1877. Chapter 9, Man of the Reindeer Epoch, which gives us an image of our early ancestors, that the reindeer epoch, approaching nearer to the present age than those already enumerated previously in the book, presents man under a more favourable aspect and affords a better view of his traits of character and manner of living. Not only the sturdy climate spurs him to action, but a higher type is supplanting the original savages. For food, these people were essentially hunters and lived principally upon the reindeer, which they attacked with their spears and arrows. The horse, elk, ibex, ox, and the chamois formed a considerable part of their food. The meat was cooked on the rough hearths, and the skull and the long bones were split open in order to extract the brains and marrow, which formed a delicious dish. To this they also added the fish and occasionally certain birds, such as the heathcock, swan, and owl. The chase did not always afford them sufficient food, and at times they were forced to subsist on the water rat. Enough evidence has been produced to show that these people were cannibals. Human finger joints were discovered among the remains of cooking at Solutree in Mackinac. Monsieur Roussel found at a point in the road from Genoa to Nice some human bones which had been calcined and were of a whitish colour, light and friable. The incrustations on their surface still contained small fragments of carbon, and some of them showed notches made by some sharp instrument. In one of the grottos of northern Italy, Monsieur Costa de Beauregard found the small shin bone of a child, which had been carefully emptied and cleansed. Professor Owen thinks he can recognise the trace of human teeth on some human skulls and children's bones found in Scotland, and promiscuously mixed with sculptured flints and the remains of pottery. Now, this last statement interested me for obvious reasons, and I wondered if we could find further information along the lines of locations and the age of these finds. So I went searching through the records of archaeological digs in Scotland to see which particular dig Professor Owen was alluding to. The study of cannibalism in archaeology presents a fairly complex and often contentious field of inquiry. While the notion of eating human flesh can evoke strong reactions and certainly captures the public imagination, the archaeological proof of such practices requires meticulous analysis and careful interpretation. Osteoarchaeological analysis plays a crucial role in determining evidence of cannibalism. Cultural significance and intent behind evidence of bone modification can differ considerably. For example, cut marks on human bones might signify defleshing as part of a burial rite, dismemberment following violent conflict, or the systematic processing of human remains for consumption. So we need a thorough understanding of any surrounding artifacts, the context of the archaeological site, whether a burial chamber, a settlement, or some other type of location, and the usual mortuary practices of whatever time period we're investigating. Without these precautions, attributing cannibalism based solely on bone modifications found would remain dubious. Within the Scottish archaeological record, direct evidence for cannibalism remains limited compared to some other regions of Britain and continental Europe. However, this does not negate the possibility that such practices occurred. Bone preservation is heavily influenced by soil conditions, and acidic soils, common in parts of Scotland, can lead to greater degradation of skeletal remains over time. In addition to this, archaeological discoveries are often sporadic, and many sites might remain undiscovered or only partially explored. If cannibalism was a rarer, highly ritualized practice within certain prehistoric communities, the likelihood of encountering direct archaeological evidence would be inherently lower compared to more commonplace activities like formal burial. I'll try to provide something of a rundown of archaeological findings in Scotland that have been or could be interpreted as evidence of cannibalism. We'll go a wee bit through the prehistoric periods with a bit of a focus on Neolithic and Bronze Age findings, which are the periods for which the majority of skeletal evidence exists. We'll also, of course, address the enduring legend of Sonny Bean, examining its relationship to potential archaeological realities. So, Sonny Bean, myth or historical fact? From the East Aberdeenshire Observer for the 22nd of November 1878, we have Sonny Bean, the Scottish cannibal. This is a melodrama in existence which has been at times popular with a certain class of playgoers, founded on an old London legend known as Sweeney Todd, the barber of Fleet Street. The legend goes that Sweeney kept a barber's shop in Fleet Street and his wife made and sold mutton pies in a shop adjoining. The gist of the story may be gathered from the combined assertions that the barber's customers were never seen to emerge from the shaving establishment, and that his wife, the pie maker, was never known to purchase mutton, and for his crimes it is reported that he was convicted and hanged at Newgate. But minute inquiries made into all the old papers likely to throw light on the subject fail to say that such a criminal existed. The nearest resemblance to such a case, in fact, is that of Sonny Bean, 300 years ago in Scotland. And though most of our readers have heard of this notorious cannibal, the main facts are perhaps unknown to the reading public. Hence, as a matter of mere historical interest, we may relate what is known or believed to be known on the subject. In the early part of the reign of James VI of Scotland, that is to say, between 1567 and 1603, Sonny Bean, a Scotchman, revived the inhuman practice alleged to have been common among his countrymen in St. Jerome's days. Sonny, whose proper name was Alexander Bain, was born in the neighbourhood of Prestonpans, about 8 or 9 miles east of Edinburgh. His father was a hedger and ditcher, and his mother was a notable spinner on her little wheel. Sonny, when old enough to carry a hedge bill or spade, was taken out to the fields by his father to assist him, but he liked hunting rabbits on the links far better, having, as it seemed, a constitutional disinclination to any settled, honest industry. While still quite a youth, he ran away from home and wandered up and down the country, at first getting a chance job now and then. It might be as an assistant drover of black cattle, a haymaker, a stacker of peats, a grubber up of whins for fuel, a cleaner out of some old house drain, or whatever else happened to be readiest, but always mindful of what he deemed the main chance, which was to pick up and appropriate to his own use any handy article he found lying about, to rob gentlemen's dovecots and farmers' hen roosts at night, to poach for game either by night or by day, to make nocturnal raids on fish ponds, and otherwise to make fell fend at the expense of other people, he being as regardless of the 8th commandment in the Decalogue as if it had never been given. The land was then infested with a number of idle vagabonds like Sonny, able-bodied fellows who went about sorning, as it was called, on the public, to the unspeakable oppression and terror of poor tenants and cotters and lone families in otherwise quiet neighbourhoods. The great majority of these vagrants lived without any regret or subjection either to the laws of the land or to those of God and nature. There were hundreds, if not thousands, of them in the south and centre of Scotland, from the Highland line downwards. Some travelled regularly about in gangs like gypsies, with horses and carts, asses and panniers, camping by the roadsides. Others foraged in pairs, a male and a female confederate. Sawney fell after a short while into the second group. He took up with a woman as vicious as himself, of the real Helen MacDougall Burke's type, and with her he wandered about for some time, committing many atrocious acts, including, it is said, more than one deliberate murder. At length they came in their peregrinations to the wild district of East Galloway, now the stewartry of Kirkcudbright, in the northern shores of the Solway Firth. Here they took up their lodging in a cave by the seaside, a pleasant enough habitation for such savages in summer-time, and approachable in winter by none but such as themselves. In this cave, marvellous to tell, Sawney and his paramour lived for upwards of 25 years, having both children and grandchildren in that time. They never separated, kept no other company but themselves, lay all together like pigs in a sty, and supported themselves entirely by robbing. Moreover, every person whom they robbed, they murdered. And the body of everyone whom they murdered, they carried forthwith to their den, where it was cut into quarters, pickled and stored up ready for use, except such part as was eaten fresh. In their ordinary way of business, they found that they had always enough human flesh for actual consumption, and oftentimes, when they had a superfluity, they would carry the dismembered carcasses away a good distance along the coast, and pitch them at high water over the cliffs into the sea, so that the receding tide might carry them off. Frequently, however, legs and arms were cast up at different places, to the great astonishment of the beholders. Persons going about their lawful occupations often fell into the hands of these merciless cannibals, and never returned home again, or were more heard tell of. The travellers to and from places between Dumfries and Wigton disappeared unaccountably. At length the whole country was alarmed, and private spies were sent out into all parts to find out, if possible, how these mysterious disappearances occurred. For a length of time their strictest searches and inquiries were to no purpose. The very existence of Sawney Bean and his gang in the neighbourhood was not suspected, for they never frequented any market for provisions or showed themselves abroad during the day, and so, with his wife, children, and grandchildren, the monster carried on his barbarous work with impunity in the meantime. The wretches would attack 4, 5, or 6 men together, if they were on foot and unarmed. As for horsemen, 2 were as many as they would ever set on, and then with such caution that an ambuscade was laid to secure them, ride which way they would, provided one or both made their escape from the first assailants. Thus, whose ill fortune soever it was to fall into their barbarous hands, he or she never came off alive. The place in which they pigged together was, as we have said, solitary. Indeed, when the tide came up, the water went for near 200 yards into the recesses of the cave, which reached almost a mile underground. If one or more of the gang ever happened to be seen, therefore, by any person, which was but seldom, it was not in the least suspected that they had come out of any such dismal place of perpetual darkness and horror, where no human being could well exist for a week, if by any accident he had been forced to take refuge in it from the stormy waves. During the time the gang pursued their horrid trade, several honest travellers were taken up on suspicion, and some of them were even wrongfully hanged on merely circumstantial evidence. One or more innocent innkeepers, moreover, suffered death on the scaffold, for no other reason than that persons who had been lost were known to have lain in their hostelries the night before they disappeared, and were supposed to have been robbed and murdered by them. To such an extent did the terror thus created go, that several of the publicans on the coast road left off their business for fear of being charged with a like criminal offence. After the lapse of a quarter of a century, the actual criminals were found out. The discovery was made in this way. A farmer was coming home one evening from a neighbouring fair with his wife behind him on a pillion. Sawney's gang waylaid them at a lonely spot and fell upon them in a most furious manner. The man, to save himself as well as he could, fought it bravely against them with sword and pistol, and rode some of them down by main force of his horse. His poor wife, however, fell off in the conflict and was presently murdered before her husband's face. The female cannibals forthwith cut her throat, and then proceeded to still more disgusting hyena-like atrocities. This unparalleled barbarity had nerved the stout-hearted countryman to make the most obstinate resistance, as he could expect nothing but the like treatment if he fell into their impious hands, and so he kept off his assassins with the desperate valour of a true blue Briton at bay, till, when his strength was nearly spent, 20 or 30 horsemen coming home from the same fair made their appearance on a sudden, and Sawney Bean and his bloodthirsty clan hastily withdrew, made the best of their way through a neighbouring wood, and so retired to their den. The farmer, thus rescued, was the first that had ever come off alive after falling into the hands of the unnatural miscreants. He told his deliverers what had happened, and showed them the bloody spectacle of his wife, whose mangled body the wretches had dragged to some distance off, but had not been able to carry away. Struck with amazement at what they saw and heard, they could take no immediate steps to pursue and capture the gang, but a moment's reflection led them to surmise that the mysterious murders which had for so many years alarmed and disgraced that part of the kingdom must have been committed by the same unhallowed hands. There was evidently now a clue to the discovery of the murderers, and the authorities set to work accordingly to ferret them out. A body of about 400 men, well armed, set out on horseback, accompanied by several bloodhounds. The man whose wife had been murdered guided them to the spot where he had been attacked, and the wood into which the gang had escaped was thoroughly searched, but no sign of a living being or of a human habitation could be found anywhere in it. From the wood the searchers went down to the seaside, and, the tide being out, went all along the shore in both directions. They passed by the mouth of Sawney Bean's cave, but took no notice of it as a place of habitation, there being neither footmarks on the sand, nor smoke on the roof, nor markings on the walls, nor any trace of life. But some of the bloodhounds, true to their peculiar instinct, stopped at the entrance, ran into the cave, and set up a most hideous barking, yelping, and howling, indicative of the presence there of something suspicious. The leader of the party accordingly turned back and peered anxiously into the dismal hole, but all within was as dark as Erebus and still as death. The dogs, however, kept up making a great noise, went away and quite out of sight, and seemed very unwilling to come out when called. Torches were therefore sent for, and a great many men ventured into the cave, while the rest kept watch at the entrance. It was found that there were several intricate turnings and windings in the interior, though not so difficult to explore as those in the famous labyrinth of Crete. The habitation of Sawney Bean was at length reached, and it presented such a sight as probably never met human eye before. The exploring party beheld to their great surprise the legs, arms, thighs, hands, and feet of men, women, and children hung up like dried beef, and found some limbs lying in pickle, while deposited in the den was a great mass of money, both gold and silver, watches, rings, swords, and pistols, a quantity of clothes, both linen and woolen, and an infinitude of other things which had been taken from the persons murdered. All these articles were of course seized, the mangled human remains were brought away and decently buried, and Sonny Bean and his murdering family, which besides himself consisted of his wife, 8 sons, 6 daughters, 18 grandsons, and 14 granddaughters, begotten in incest, were all secured, pinioned, and carried prisoners to Edinburgh. The whole country flocked in multitudes to see this cursed tribe as they passed Castle Douglas, New Galloway, Moniaive, Penpint, Leadhills, Biggar, and Bridgehouse to the Scottish capital. On their arrival in that ancient city, they were lodged for the night in the heart of Midlothian, the old toll booth, and the next day they were conducted to Leith Sands under a strong escort. There the men had their hands and feet cut off and were suffered to bleed to death in sight of the wife, daughters, and grandchildren. There needed no formal process or regular trial, as the miscreants had been taken red fang, as the Scotch lawyers express it, or flagrante crimine comprehensi, as the Code of Justinian has it. The rest of the family, says our authority, were then all burned in 3 several fires, all dying, like the man, without repentance, but cursing and venting dire imprecations to the last gasp of life. The number of people Sonny Bean and his clan had killed could never be exactly known, but it was reckoned that during the 25 years they had revelled in their inhuman career, they had washed their hands in the blood of above 1,000 men, women, and children. I've been to Sonny Bean's cave. We went earlier this year and it was a lot more difficult to get to than I had thought. A lot more difficult to get back up from, and there is no way anybody lived in what's known as Sonny Bean's cave. There's no way. It doesn't fit the description in this article either. It didn't go for a mile underground. It didn't stretch so far in that you wouldn't notice there being some kind of life in there fairly quickly upon entering. And it's too narrow for the sheer amount of family Sonny Bean's said to have had. There's no way. That was my takeaway from visiting Sonny Bean's cave. By all means, pay to visit if you feel the need to check what I'm saying. But you need to be hardy, physically hardy, and have far more stamina than I do. For getting back up again. I needed 2 Monroe hill walkers to help me get back up. So be warned. It's not worth it. Nobody lived in this cave. I would put money on it. From Scottish Notes and Queries, published 1906 to 7, Volume 8, we have Sonny Bean. Mr. S.R. Crockett, in his novel The Grey Man, giving the adventures of Lancelot Kennedy, has revived an old lie again in the history of Sonny Bean. I presume that the novelist considers himself justified in adopting any legend and fashioning his story along with it, but there ought to be a stratum of truth at the bottom. The story of Sonny Bean is a clumsy Cockney invention, without any foundation whatever in fact, and Crockett, in utilising it, has simply pandered to English prejudice, like Andrew Lang and other Anglified Scots. Formerly, we had Sir Anthony Weldon and other English blackguards vilifying our nation, which usually failed, despite the grossness of attacks, on account of their brutish ignorance and ridiculous falsity. Now the crafty Englishman either employs a hard-up literary Scot to defend his own country or recommends the job to him, and they have been very successful. Coofs of the Henley and Crossland type go on an independent course. There is money in it, but all right with a desire to pull us down below the English level, and that is low enough. Sawney Bean is immediately raised to the dignity of a classic, and our nation execrated without rhyme or reason. A friend showed me some time ago a copy of the Newcastle Weekly Chronicle dated the 1st of August 1896, and in it there is a circumstantial history of Sawney Bean given, extending to 2 columns. The Novocastrian scribe coolly premises that the monster cannibal's real name was Alexander Bain. How did he know that? By the way, what a delicate and peculiarly English compliment that was to Professor Bain of Aberdeen, who was then alive. We are then informed that Sawney flourished for 25 years up to 1603, and over 1,000 murders are placed to his credit. How's that for high, as they say in California? Any credulous fool who will believe that egregious falsehood is fit for an asylum. Strange to say, we cannot get corroborative testimony as to the career of this notorious villain. None of the histories of Scotland that I have read mentions him. Even Andrew Lang might have dragged Sawney into his net, but he didn't, in those needless volumes of his anent Scottish history. Sawney does not appear in Pitcairn's Ancient Criminal Trials in Scotland, which includes the period of Sawney's ongons, nor does he appear in the 2 sets of statistical accounts of Scotland, Sinclair's and Blackwood's, although similar affairs are recorded, nor is Mr. Bean to be found in the various gazetteers and guidebooks of Galloway and elsewhere. Very strange, isn't it? Well, where is the chronicle of this infamous wretch to be seen? Alas, and must the truth be told? It shows up in a cheap, paltry Yorkshire miscellany, lives of celebrated highwaymen and robbers, pirates, etc., printed by Milner and Sowerby of Halifax. This vile book, to a great extent, is the English lad's vademecum, or indispensable companion, although it has latterly been superseded by Yankee yarns concerning the doings of Deadwood Dick. To the ordinary English mind, their real heroes are Jack Sheppard, Dick Turpin, Jerry Abershaw, and others of that ilk. Gloating over the deeds of such ruffians, the hope is engendered that they may one day achieve similar renown. Having so many English scoundrels to record, the compiler of the Halifax volume patriotically wrote or got written for his collection the veracious story of Sawney Bean. There is a Grub Street flavour about the narrative, which plainly indicates its Cockney origin. Something akin to Sweeney Todd, the demon barber of Gray's Inn Lane, who entrapped his customers and supplied their bodies to a noted pork pie shop on the opposite side, through a subway or tunnel under the street. Of course, when a young fellow in England, I was confronted and affronted with this stupid lie about Sawney Bean, I denounced it as a fabrication. Then the cheap catchpenny publication was shown to me. Would I dare to dispute that? But I did, and denounced it likewise. My denials went for nothing. They said so sympathetically that the whole of Scotland was in league to keep it dark, and so on. We love Scotland more than the truth, and other Johnsonian diatribes. There, you see, let any English wastrel circulate a trashy falsehood to the detriment of an entire nation, the vagabond will receive credence, and the lie will flourish, simply because they want it so. It never dawns upon their besotted brains that they have been duped and deceived. Oh dear, no. If any correspondent has trustworthy information to communicate concerning the writer of the Sawney Bean romance, will he be pleased to disseminate it? That's from Alba, writing from Melbourne, Australia. And we have a response. It is not my intention to follow Alba along the bypaths of belligerent patriotism into which his pursuit of Sawney Bean has seduced him. Suffer me only to say in passing how much I regret some of the expressions he has permitted himself to use in speaking of names so deservedly honoured in the literary world as those of Mr. S.R. Crockett and Mr. Andrew Lang, not to mention others less closely connected with Scotland by birth. My purpose in writing is rather to dispute the assertion which forms the pièce de résistance of his interesting contribution to the January number of Scottish Notes and Queries, to the effect that the story of Sawney Bean is purely an English fabrication. In making this assertion, Alba is something less than just to the genius, or shall we say the depravity, of his own countrymen. At all events, the story of Sawney Bean, as issued from the press of Milner and Sowerby, was borrowed or lifted from historical and traditional tales of the south of Scotland, published and to a considerable extent written by John Nicholson of Kirkcudbright. I agree with Alba as regards the Grub Street flavour of the English compilation. The moral reflections so dear to the average Scottish heart occurring in Nicholson's narrative are ruthlessly suppressed by the English penman, while the culinary details of the story, understood to be more congenial to the soul of the typical Englishman, are carefully and conscientiously transcribed. In other respects, however, Milner and Sowerby's publication is merely an abbreviation of the Scottish version. The story of Sawney Bean, one of the most repulsive, incredible, and impossible stories that was probably ever penned, is not to be lightly dismissed as a fabrication. It is mentioned, I believe, in Hector Boece's History of the Scots. Not having the history at hand, I am unable to give the exact reference, but I understand that it occurs somewhere near the close of the book. Nicholson gives no authority for his narrative, but affirms it to be a tradition thoroughly well attested by historical evidence. There's no smoke without some fire, as the proverb hath it. The gruesome tale undoubtedly rests on a basis of fact, which in course of time became overlaid, as such tales are apt to be, with a mass of fictitious details and horrific embellishments. What John Nicholson did was to simply take the tradition at its high water mark, with all its imaginative adornments, blending indiscriminately fact and fiction, and presenting a photograph, so to call it, of the whole for the benefit of succeeding generations. Alba does not need to be reminded what a boundless capacity there is in tradition to expand and accumulate materials as years roll on. An illustration of this occurs within my own recollection. In my boyhood's days, 40 years after the crime had been committed, the country was still shuddering over the frightful atrocities perpetrated by Burke and Hare in Edinburgh. Rumour literally ran riot over the matter. The victims who perished, according to popular report, were to be numbered not by scores but by hundreds, while the mysterious and awful word "burking," heard in whispers on the lips of their elders, made children afraid to venture out of doors at night, or even to go to sleep in the dark. In common with most people, I, a credulous youngster at the time with a taste for bluggy stories, was profoundly convinced of the truth of the appalling details. When, however, at a later date, I read the true version of the tragedies, it came upon one with a distinct sense of disappointment to learn that only 16 victims, I think, had been done to death, instead of the hundreds asserted by popular tradition. Somehow it seemed as if the murderous ruffians had fallen immeasurably short of the giddy grandeur to which the voice of rumour had raised them. John Nicholson, however, made no mistake of this kind. He seized the tradition full-blown and apparently current in his day, and wrote it down with all its ghastly accretions, gross exaggerations, and unspeakable infamy, with the result that credulous people, like the English of Alba's acquaintance, finding the story in print, accepted its statements as they would the statements of the Bible, thereby moving Alba to wrath and gnashing of teeth. The facts of the case, I imagine, were something like these. During a peculiarly lawless and unsettled period in Scottish history when every man did pretty much what was right in his own eyes, a worthless scoundrel by name Sonny Bean or Bain, with his equally worthless wife, betook himself from East Lothian to the wilds of Galloway. Using a license quite permissible to writers of historical fiction, Mr. S. R. Crockett was chosen to post-date Sonny Bean by nearly 200 years. It was during the reign of James the First of Scotland, not James the Sixth of Scotland, that the miscreant lived. I speak on the authority of Nicholson. In Galloway, husband and wife, with their infamous family, took up their abode by the seashore in a cave concerning which tradition has some marvellous tales to tell. There they led a degraded, savage, brutalized mode of existence, subsisting by plunder, maintaining themselves by sheep stealing and cattle lifting, and occasionally murdering those who resisted their depredations. Their nefarious career continued over a period of several years until, in the end, the king in person, returned from his long captivity in England, put a summary stop to their brutal crimes. Whether they were cannibals or not is somewhat difficult to determine. Nicholson's narrative strongly asserts that this was the case, but speaks at the same time of mutilated bodies of victims being flung into the sea, which does not quite accord with the cannibalistic theory. The supposed relics of humanity discovered in the Loathly Den, where the miscreants were finally captured, were, in all probability, nothing more than the bones of animals and unsightly half-consumed fragments of slaughtered sheep and cattle. The anatomy of the human body was not so well understood in those days as it is at present. At the same time, it must be borne in mind that cannibalism has more than once been attributed to the people of Scotland. In the early centuries of the Christian era, St. Jerome testified from personal knowledge that the Scots were addicted to man-eating. Fortunately, however, for Alba's perturbed feelings, the Scots, at the date referred to by the saint, meant people from Ireland, not the natives of Scotland. Then we have the account of the sanguinary Sonny Bean and his infamous brood, reputed cannibals all of them, and again, in the reign of James II of Scotland, there is the story of the Ogre of the Sidlaws, a tale even better attested by history than the one at present under discussion. There may, alas, be some truth in these stories. Such blots on the fair fame of Scotland are not altogether impossible. France and Italy, and perhaps every civilized nation under the sun, have similar examples of abnormal depravity to deplore in their annals. But even granted that two instances of cannibalism are traceable in Scottish history, the fact will not brand the whole inhabitants of the country with the stigma anthropophagi, as Alba seems to apprehend. One swallow does not make a summer, nor two, for that matter. If indeed it could be scientifically proved that the teeth of Scottish people are sharper than those of their neighbours, distinctly betokening anthropophaginous proclivities, whereas the Englishman, being a ruminating animal of the bovine type, is incapable of such mastication, if that theory could be established, the accusation against Scotland might assume a serious aspect. But until that day arrives, Alba may safely leave ignorant Englishmen wallowing in abuse of things Scottish to the contempt which their rudeness and stupidity deserve. Suffer me to allude to an incident which shows, I think, how such aspersions may best be met. Between 30 and 40 years ago, two large religious denominations in Scotland were desirous of becoming united. After protracted negotiations, the proposal, for a time, had to be abandoned, owing to some extent to the opposition of a few devout persons in the remote Highlands who refused to acknowledge as Christian brethren people who, they alleged, not content with laying sacrilegious hands on the sacred scriptures, were also in the habit of winding up their unhallowed orgies of scones and buttermilk with, horrible dict too, toothsome titbits of cooked babies. So far as I am aware, no person belonging to the maligned denomination felt himself a penny the worse for so preposterous a calumny. Having a conscience void of offence in the matter of babies, the slanderous accusation was merely regarded as an illustration of the deplorable depths to which religious bigotry, coupled with conceited ignorance, can descend. It only remains to be added that the union, formally defeated, has now been happily consummated. There is a fair probability that in years to come Great Britain may still continue to possess within its borders stupid Englishmen who dislike Scotland, and peppery Scotsmen who resent the dislike. It hardly seems to me as if the tone of Alba's contribution will do much to sweeten relations between them. This, I think, a thing to be regretted. To all intents and purposes, English and Scottish now form one people. For better, for worse, the two kingdoms have become one, owning allegiance to the same king, obeying the same laws, inspired by the same ideals, and recognising, one would fain hope, that an injury done to either of them is an injury done to both. What though there be some stupid Englishmen who, disliking the Scots, pretend to believe them cannibals, or the descendants of cannibals? Leave them to stew in the juice of their own childish imaginings. If a Scotsman happens to enter a room where a mother is holding her infant child in her arms, and the infant, misliking the Scotsman's personal appearance, resents his intrusion by lifting up his voice in approved baby fashion, surely the wisest thing for the Scotsman to do in the circumstances is to struggle to maintain an attitude of outward unconcern, however deeply his feelings may be wounded, rather than provide louder demonstrations of hostility and incur the undying enmity of the mother by pricking the baby with a pin. And that is from W.S. Now, despite being a captivating story, the historical and archaeological evidence that would support the existence of Sonny Bean and his cannibalistic family is conspicuously absent. Contemporary historical records from the alleged period of their activity, including newspapers, diaries, and official documents, make no mention of the widespread disappearances of the hundreds of people the legend claims were abducted, murdered, and eaten by Sonny and his cohorts. Furthermore, inconsistencies exist within the various versions of the tale regarding the timeline and specific details of the events. Scholarly investigations into the origins of Sonny Bean's story strongly suggest that he is likely a fictional figure. The tale first appeared in British chapbooks, a form of popular street literature, and gained wider circulation through sensationalised crime catalogues like the Newgate Calendar in the 18th and 19th centuries. Some researchers propose that the legend may have originated as political propaganda intended to denigrate the Scots, particularly following the Jacobite rebellions. Others suggest it was simply a penny dreadful story, a work of fiction designed to thrill and horrify readers. Notably, the Sonny Bean legend bears a striking resemblance to earlier mythical cannibal figures in Scotland, such as Christy Cleek, a mythical cannibal said to have lived during a famine in the mid-14th century. From Sabine Baring Gould's The Book of Werewolves, published in 1865, in Chapter 8, we're given, Winton also has a passage in his metrical chronicle regarding a cannibal who lived shortly before his own time, and he may easily have heard about him from surviving contemporaries. It was about the year 1340, when a large portion of Scotland had been devastated by the arms of Edward III. About Perth there was the country, sae waste that wonder was to see, for until well great space thereby was nother house left nor herbery. Of deer there was then sick Folsom, that they will near come to the town, sae great default was near that stead, that mony were in hunger dead. A carle, they said, was near thereby that would act sets commonly, children and women for to slay, and swains that he might overta, and ate them all that he get might, Christen cleek till name behight, that sarry life continued he, while waste but folk was the country. We have only to compare these two cases with those recorded in the last two chapters, and we see at once how the popular mind in Great Britain had lost the idea of connecting change of form with cannibalism. A man guilty of the crimes committed by the Angus Brigand or the Carl of Perth would have been regarded as a werewolf in France or Germany, and would have been tried for lycanthropy. St. Jerome, by the way, brought a sweeping charge against the Scots. He visited Gaul in his youth about 880 CE, and he writes, "When I was a young man in Gaul, I may have seen the Atticoti, a British people who live upon human flesh. And when they find herds of pigs, droves of cattle, or flocks of sheep in the woods, they cut off the haunches of the men and the breasts of the women, and these they regard as great dainties." In other words, they prefer the shepherd to his flock. Gibbon, who quotes the passage, says on it, "If in the neighbourhood of the commercial and literary town of Glasgow a race of cannibals has really existed, we may contemplate in the period of the Scottish history the opposite extremes of savage and civilised life. Such reflections tend to enlarge the circle of our ideas and to encourage the pleasing hope that New Zealand may produce in a future age the Hume of the Southern Hemisphere." Nothing like a spot of racism from our forebears. From the Glasgow Herald for the 17th of April 1863, we have Glasgow Cannibals. From Punch. "We thought that the Scotch had given over cannibalism, and that one Christian o' the Cleek, mentioned by Sir Walter, was the last Scottish gentleman who adhered to the custom of eating other Scottish gentlemen. It seems, however, at all events by implication, that even in Glasgow, which is now the capital of Scotland, the practice is still pursued, although the writer of the following passage in the Glasgow Herald very properly treats the habit as one not suited to the best society. But the dinner! Aye, there's the rub, for who would dine on boiled potatoes and a Glasgow magistrate at home, when he could feast on the fat things of many lands in the Queen's rooms, and at the expense of the Queen Insurance Company?" Mr. Punch was himself as much surprised as a gentleman ought to be at anything. He is well acquainted with Glasgow and has met many of the excellent magistrates, but though he emphatically admits that they were all nice men in a social sense, it did not occur to him that they were liable to be eaten by their fellow citizens. Municipal authorities are generally supposed to be good, rather at than on a plate. But it would seem that Glasgow, viewed from a magistrate's point of sight, is not where he eats, but where he is eaten, and devoured with potatoes too. But perhaps this is a complimentary, and implies that the worthy magistrates are regarded as the salt of the earth. We sincerely hope that the Glasgow kitchens, far and away the greatest invention of the day, will gradually tend to wean the Glasgowian public from this objectionable practice. For ourselves, sooner than eat a magistrate, we would live on herrings all our days, and that's just an awful word for one of our appetite to say. Punch was like an older version of parody accounts online. It wasn't to be taken seriously, but it did kind of show the racism that was going on within Britain and towards those that were not English. From the John O'Groat Journal for the 16th of February 1865, we're given the Aborigines of Caithness. "Mr. Editor, I have in my time seen a good deal written about the original inhabitants of this country, which I have read with perhaps little attention, but certainly with less belief. And even when I see accounts of discoveries which are supposed to throw light on the dark times when the Picts lived, I somehow never forget Drum's Lang Ladle. I do not in any way wish to discourage excavations and other means of arriving at a knowledge of who the Picts were and what they did, but I do wish that those who undertake to reason upon the subject would see to the soundness of the statements on which they base their arguments. The people whose bones were dug up at Kees may have been declared to be cannibals on very slender grounds, but such arguments against the supposition as are given by Mr. Miller in his paper on the subject, copied in last journal, are absolutely without foundation. Mr. Miller's argument is this, that Christianity had been introduced among the Picts of Kees, and that Christians can never turn cannibals. Now, there is mentioned in the history of Scotland an individual named Christian o' the Cleek, who was of another opinion, and who can say but such another Christian may have lived on the Bay of Kees. One need not be anxious for the credit of his ancestors, for since they could kill little children for sport, this other item will add but little to the load of dishonour they have to bear already. Besides, if at Thurso they could roast a bishop, might they not eat another man in case? Again, the only evidence he brings forward that these bones belong to Christian times is that such a tower is said to have been built by one of the name Malcolm. Supposing the tradition to be true, it proves nothing unless it can be shown that St. Columba was the first who bore that name. Malcolm does not mean the servant of Columba, but the name has arisen from a mistake. The Perthshire Courier for the 13th of August 1912 has an article entitled Cannibalism for us. It is to what Mr. Proteus calls the social history of Crieff that a student of human nature like myself turns with the greatest interest. His facts are taken chiefly from old charters and church records. From these we learn that Crieff was a place of some importance, with a clergyman of its own in the person of Brutius before 1199, and at that period the most talked of event would undoubtedly be the erection of Inchaffrey Abbey. For some years previous to 1340, famine prevailed throughout Strathearn, and it combined with the miseries created by the war, reduced what inhabitants there were to the utmost extremities. Strathearn at this time was practically a desert, and the wild deer coming down from the mountains struggled along with mankind for the barest sustenance. Grass was eaten as food, and it is said cannibalism was not unknown. There seems to be a record of the deeds of one real cannibal. This was Christian of the Cleek, or Christy Cleek. He was so called from the iron hook which he used to seize passers-by as he lay in ambush for them. Acorns and nuts were also greedily devoured and were said to cause agonizing diseases. And for more on this, we have from the Crieff Journal for the 12th of December 1879, the Siege of Perth in 1339. Victory had thus rewarded the patriotic cause, but the condition of the country in consequence of the famine was desperate and appalling. About Perth, says Winton, the land was so waste that it was a wonder to see, for within a great space there was neither house nor lodging. Even the wild deer, seeing a wilderness before them, had left their native haunts and were roaming over the desert around the town. Near thereby, says Winton, that is, in the vicinity of Perth, lurked a hideous wretch who amid the prevailing devastation was driven by gnawing hunger and his own savage instincts to a degradation beneath the level of the prowling wolves. Christine Cleek was his name, or in popular tradition, Christy of the Cleek. He had a wife who accompanied him, and they both, gaunt and fierce with want, threw off all human sympathies and betook themselves to a secluded den, where they prepared gins and traps for the ensnarement of such stray wanderers as might pass that way. Young men, women, and children, These, when caught, like game in the diabolical engines, were butchered by the ferocious couple who carried the dead bodies to their cavernous abode and supported their wretched lives by cannibalism. Our old historians agree in asserting this horrible fact, which, therefore, we cannot spurn away as fabulous like the monstrous slander which a great father of the Church threw upon a tribe of the ancient Scots. St. Jerome, writing in the beginning of the 5th century, declares that the Atacoti, a Scottish tribe inhabiting the country of the Lennox, were addicted to cannibalism, devouring human beings who fell in their way as they wandered or hunted in the woods. It has been attempted to be shown that Jerome's Latin is capable of a different sense, namely, that the Atacoti only fed on the cattle, sheep, and pigs which they seized in the forests, but this explanation is wholly untenable. His words can bear no such construction. He says that the savages, when they hunted the woods for prey, they attacked the shepherd rather than his flock, and so on, describing their feast, and adds in confirmation that in his boyhood he had seen some Atacoti in Gaul who were cannibals, but who, we must suppose, were publicly exhibited as a show, just as we have seen wild men from wild climes in a penny booth on the Inch furiously making believe to masticate raw flesh when they jabbered in their native tongue with a strong twang of the salt market of Glasgow or the Murraygate of Dundee. Gibbon notices the passage in Jerome but finds no reason to doubt his veracity. Their southern neighbours, says the historian of the Decline and Fall, have felt and perhaps exaggerated the cruel depredations of the Scots and Picts, and a valiant tribe of Caledonia, the Atacoti, the enemies and afterwards the soldiers of Valentinian, are accused by an eyewitness of delighting in the taste of human flesh. If in the neighbourhood of the commercial and literary town of Glasgow a race of cannibals has really existed, we may contemplate in the period of the Scottish history the opposite extremes of savage and civilised life. Such reflections tend to enlarge the circle of our ideas and to encourage the pleasing hope that New Zealand may produce in some future age the Hume of the Southern Hemisphere. But Jerome's veracity may be reasonably questioned. He wrote in times when belief, founded on Pliny's wonders of natural history, was common not only about the anthropophagi, but also about men whose heads do grow beneath their shoulders. And if, as Gibbon admits, the depredations of the Caledonians were exaggerated, why not their modes of living at home, of which strangers were utterly ignorant? St. Jerome's works are full of the incredibilities of his age, and whatever he may have seen in Gaul, he had no knowledge of the condition and habits of the Caledonian tribes, so that we may safely dismiss his Atacoti story as fable. The very tribe whom he maligns furnished 2 bands of soldiers to the Roman army, which bands were stationed in Italy and Illyricum, so that these Atacoti, at least, must have abandoned their anthropophagy before they enrolled under the imperial standard. In a word, the Atacoti, we believe, were no more cannibals, though a credulous saint fancied they were, than Dean Swift was a cannibal because in 1729 he issued his modest proposal recommending for the benefit of the poor people in Ireland that they should dispose of 100,000 of their year-old children to be served up, seasoned with a little pepper and salt at the dinner tables of the rich. But return to Christie, surnamed of the Clique, from the species of instruments of capture which he used in his vile pursuit. For a considerable time he followed his inhuman career, as Winton has it. That sorry life continued he, till waste but, or without, folk was the country. That is to say, he went on ensnaring, killing, and eating till victims grew scarce. Then he and the she-fiend, his wife, perhaps forgetting their customary caution and growing careless of detection, like Burke and Hare in similar circumstances, the rumour arose that two cannibals were keeping a court of Cacus among the hills near Perth, and men were sent to search for and seize them, and they were both taken. On being brought to judgment, they declared that famine had forced them to their unnatural courses. They were executed, and so the land was cleared of the terrible disgrace which, however, it incurred once again during the reign of James II, when, if both is to be believed, a cannibal family were discovered in a cave on the Angus coast. Comparisons of Sawney and Christie. From the Dundee Courier and Argus, the 9th of March 1883, we've an article entitled Eccentric Characters in Perth and Perthshire, Bailey Luke, Chapter 6. In the beginning of November 1828, an unimaginable horror overspread the country, namely the appalling discovery of the long series of murders committed by Burke and Hare at the west port of Edinburgh. The idea that such atrocities could have been systematically perpetrated for nearly a year in the heart of the Scottish capital seemed like the dream of insanity. Readers of our elder chronicles were reminded of the cannibals who figured in them. Christie of the Cleek and his wife who set traps for human victims on whom they might feast, and Sawney Bean, called the Monster of Scotland, who, with his wife and their progeny, lurked in a cavern on the Angusshire coast and killed and devoured all strangers that came within their reach. Those were the only wretches in our annals with whom Burke and Hare could be compared as carrying on a regular trade of murder for their livelihood. The public horror was intense, as the purpose of the murders was to supply the schools of anatomy with subjects for dissection, and that source of supply being now stopped, there was the greater reason to apprehend that the violation of graves would be attempted more extensively than ever, and therefore the watching of churchyards was more strictly attended to in all quarters. At the same time, the dread of burking became universal, the burkers being believed to prowl about in the dark through town and country with sticking plasters in their hands, ready to clap them over the mouths and nostrils of boys and girls, and even of grown-up people. Well do we remember that reign of terror when the trembling youngsters taught each other the practice of an infallible method to baffle the burkers, which was by covering the mouth and nostrils with the hand when entering a close at night, so that if the plaster was applied, it only stuck to the back of the hand, and the yell for help could easily be raised. Practical jokers, too, were not slack in taking advantage of the circumstances. A brisk old residenter in Perth told us the other day that one night during that period, being set upon a frolic, he spread a little paste on a piece of brown paper, and in passing through the Cutlog Vennel, clapped it on the face of an elderly dame whom he chanced to overtake, and who instantly sank to the ground screeching dreadfully. Our informant took to his heels. The sensation was prodigious, and the authorities next day were on the eve of offering a award of £50 for the discovery of the burkers, when common sense showed them that the affair was but a jest. Yeah, funny joke, huh? In 2004, the discovery of human bones during an archaeological dig in caves beneath Culzean Castle in Ayrshire sparked initial speculation about a possible link to the Sawney Bean legend, given the castle's proximity to the area where Bean was said to have lived. However, while the discovery was significant in revealing earlier, previously unknown uses of the caves, no definitive evidence emerged to connect these remains specifically to Sawney Bean or to confirm the veracity of the cannibalism narrative associated with him. The lack of corroborating historical or archaeological evidence strongly indicates that Sawney Bean is likely a figure of folklore rather than a historical reality. Now, there was a third and even lesser known Scottish cannibal going by the name of Ewan Gavelrig, or the Ogre of Angus. And we have a somewhat elaborated story of this person from The Yellow Frigate or The Three Sisters by James Grant, published in 1855. This is from chapter 14, The Ogre of Angus. In many ancient records, but chiefly that old and quaint chronicle of Scotland written by Robert Lindsay, Laird of Pitscottie, we are informed that about 38 years before the time of our story, there was a strange being named Ewan Gavelrig, who dwelt among the Sidlaw Hills in Angus, and who, with his whole family, was accused of the strange and horrible crime of eating human flesh. At the foot of the mountains he occupied a small hut, walled with turf and thatched with heather, at a place called Tir, now Ochtertyre, but his chief haunt was that savage pass in the Sidlaws, known as the Glac of Newtile, where he waylaid, robbed, and slew the solitary travellers who chanced to be benighted in that wild and lonely district, which then lay between Dundee and Strathmore. Several who had escaped him and reached either the castle of Ballycraig, which was close by, or that of the Constable of Dundee, related how they had been encountered by a man of frightful aspect and vast stature, armed with a great mace and poniard. All accounts of him were similar. He was entirely clad in homespun grey, with rough deerskin shoes and galligaskins. A broad belt of cowhide encircled his waist, and his head, which was ever destitute of bonnet, was protected by a forest of matted black hair. A blow from his clenched hand was sufficient to brain a mountain bull or smite a charger to the earth, and those who escaped from him averred that they saw him sucking the blood from the wounds of those he had slain, and rending asunder their limbs like the branches of a withered bush, while he picked their bones as a marmoset might pick those of a chicken. In that age of credulity and marvel, such stories made a terrible impression upon the people. The whole of Angus rang with them, and others were constantly being added, each more startling than the last. The men of Strathmore, the light Lindsays, the vassals of Glamis, and even the valiant suitors of Forfar, never ventured abroad after nightfall, save in parties of 3 or 4, and always well armed with their quarter-staves or two-handed swords. Twice had men of undoubted valour and veracity averred that they had slain him, one an arrow-maker of Dundee by a wound he had given him in the throat, another who was a sword-slipper of Banff by a thrust he had given him in the breast. But they were taunted as bootless boasters, for this strange and uncouth being was still haunting the pass of the Sidlaws. A succession of these incredible stories excited the wonder and kindled the chivalry of Sir James Scrymgeour of Dudhope, the young constable of Dundee, and attended only by Lord Drummond, then Sir John of that ilk, well mounted and in full armour, on St. John's night in the year 1440. He rode to the Glac of Newtile, and there, like a paladin of old, blew 3 blasts with his bugle horn. The night was unusually dark, and the broad-sheet lightning was reddening the sky behind the black peak of Kimperney, which is 1,100 feet in height, and is the highest of the Sidlaw range. The narrow bridle path which led through the Glac was buried in obscurity, and clumps of stunted firs, which grew in the morasses, waved mournfully in the wind that sang down the mountain pass and through their wiry foliage. With their chargers shod with felt, the knights rode softly on, and as Challenger Scrymgeour, the royal standard-bearer, was a bowshot in front of Sir John Drummond. By the first blast of his bugle, the Erne was roused from its eyrie among the cliffs of Kimperney. By the second, the warder at Ballycraig was wakened from his sleep, and the Hirsels lowed on the hills. But the third had scarcely been tossed among the mountain echoes by the wind, when between him and the midnight sky, which every instant was reddened by the bright but silent lightning, The valiant scrimger saw a gigantic figure arise as if from the ground, with its long hair waving wildly, while it brandished a mace, which was furnished with a studded ball of steel that swung at the end of an iron chain. "Ane Gavelrig, man or fiend, come on!" exclaimed the knight, and though every pulse in his body for a moment stood still, he dashed forward to the combat. By one blow of his iron mace, which descended like a thunderbolt, the brains of the horse were dashed back into its rider's face, and the rider himself hurled prostrate on the path. Then the vampire or demon of Uchtertyr strode over him, brandishing his tremendous weapon and uttering a succession of wild shouts of laughter. Grasping by the throat the half-stunned Constable of Dundee and compressing his gorget of steel as if it had been a lady's ruff of lace, he would have slain him there, but for the valour of his companion and a vow he had made to build a chapel in honour of St. John if he escaped. Moreover, it is related that he was almost suffocated by the inconceivable odour that pervaded the body of his Herculean conqueror, while the latter, exulting in his victory and laughing like a hyena, was half strangling and half dragging the discomfited scrimger towards the pine woods. He neither heard nor saw Drummond, who, with his light Barbary courser, shod by soft felt, advanced over the velvet sward that bordered the wayside, but noiselessly, like the tall shadow of a man and horse. The long sharp lance of Drummond was in the rest, and urged by the full force of a galloping steed and the thrust of a powerful arm, the head of steel and a yard of the tough ash pole were driven through the body of the midnight marauder, who expired with a frightful cry. When day broke and the body of this strange man was examined, it was found to be vast in its strength and proportion, but terrible in aspect, and multiplied by 100-fold, the odour of dead carrion pervaded it. When stripped, it was found to have 4 wounds, from all of which the black blood had been freely flowing, viz., those where Drummond's lance had pierced the back and breast, and those inflicted by the barbed shaft of the arrow-maker and the sword of the Dalmasker. 2 wild and haggard-looking women, his wife and daughter, came from their hut at Uchtertyr, and as a boon begged to have the body for interment. And as a refusal would have been deemed unknightly, it was freely bestowed by the valiant Laird of Dudhope, who first hewed off the hand which had grasped him by the throat, and nailed it on the western gate of Dundee, where the skeleton fingers were to be seen in the days of James IV. In accordance with his vow, he endowed and dedicated a beautiful little chapel to St. John the Evangelist, which he built at the Skleethhuis, upon a rock near the borough, but the walls of his fair oratory had barely been raised 3 feet in height, when again the travellers who in that unruly age were hardy enough to traverse the wilds between Dundee and Strathmore were found murdered and mutilated. Children disappeared. Desperate conflicts were fought and pools of blood found in the Glac of Newtile, and all Angus was stricken with consternation by tidings that the wild man of the Sidlaws had come alive again. By sound of trumpet at the borough crosses, Sir Alexander Livingston of Callander, governor to the young King James I, proclaimed a general crusade against him. The hut at Uchtertyr was levelled and destroyed, when, in a chamber or vault below it, there were found an incredible number of bones, which the credulity of the time magnified to a perfect hecatomb of human remains. Dudhope brought 100 lances on horseback, the Lindsays of Crawford and the Abbot of Aberbrothick 1,000 each. The Laird of Baileycraig brought a band of gallant archers. A general hunt began. The whole country was searched between Stenton Craig and Edsall Kirk, till deep in a chasm of the Sidlaw Hills, the sleuth Brachs of Dudhope discovered Ian Gavelrig, who made a desperate and frantic resistance, slew 8 men and 3 horses. after threatening all the rest with dire vengeance, even if he should be slain. But he was at last overborne by blunted spears, for the knights wished to capture and not to slay him, and for a charm each had tied to his lance's head a rosemary branch with a twig of the rowan tree. Having but one hand to fight with, he was soon bound hard and fast by cords and chains, slung under a horse's belly, and thus conveyed to Dundee, where he was sentenced by the constable to be burned at the market cross, together with his wife, daughter, and son, a little child, to make sure that none of the brood so terrible should ever come alive again. Gellan Borthwick, a prebend of Dunkeld, pled hard to have the child delivered to him, and his boon was granted. But the others were burned in succession, first Gavelrig, then his wife, and next their daughter, who was also accused, whether truly or falsely we know not, of having eaten the flesh of many children. When she was coming to the place of execution, saith Robert Lindsay in his Chronicle, there gathered an huge multitude of people, and especially of women, cursing her for being so unhappy as to commit such damnable deeds, to whom she turned with an ireful countenance, saying, Wherefore chide you me, as if I had committed an unworthy act? Give me credence and trow me, if ye had experience of eating of men's and women's flesh, you will think it so delicious that you would never forbear it again. So without any sign of repentance, concludes the historian, this unhappy traitor died in the sight of the people. Her ashes, with those of her terrible parents, were scattered on the waters of the Tay, and a black whinstone in the causewayed marketplace long remained to indicate the spot where they had perished. Hugh Borthwick was the child whom the priest saved. Hence it was that he shuddered to pass through the central street of Dundee. The good old prebend, who had given him his own name, reared him for the church, in the hope that through his piety and prayers the atrocious lives of his parents might in some measure be atoned for. But Hugh broke his vows and came forth into the world to fulfil the terrible mission for which fate seemed to destine him. The people of Dundee and Angus knew not that he was the rescued child of the terrible Ian Gavelrig, the ogre of the Sidlaws, for the secret was known only to the prebends of Dunblane, and animated either by pity for the wretch himself, or a sense of shame that their holy cloister had once been desecrated by his presence, they locked the secret in their breasts. Unfortunately, we may add, for many of the actors in our drama, and most unfortunately indeed for the whole of Scotland, as the event proved. However, anyone reading the next passage we have from Borthwick Castle, or Sketches of Scotch History, published in 1880 by the Reverend J. Douglas Borthwick, Chapter 10, is pretty much left in the dark as to Hugh Borthwick's gruesome family ties, as it's merely alluded to. Another hour will bring us in sight of the foe, said the old Duke of Montrose, whose armour was richly ornamented, though somewhat old-fashioned, for his headpiece had the aureolets and long spike worn in the days of Murdoch, the Regent Duke of Albany, and his horse was gaily housed in his colours, gules and fess check, argent and azure, the bearings of the Lindsays of Crawford, and in 1 hour after that, your Majesty will find yourself enabled to punish and repay the treason of Sauchy. I would give my best barony to see his head rolling on the Gowlin Hill of Stirling. Time will show, Duke, said James with a sigh. God wot, I have no wish to shed the blood of my people, but I never liked this Laird of Sauchy. His soul was an abyss, and I never could fathom his thoughts. His chief friend and follower, a man named Hugh Borthwick, was in Stirling last night, disguised in a friar's frock. This man is a spy and a traitor, yet he escaped us, and took the eastern road, doubtless to tell what he has seen, and for all the How of Angus, I would not have lost that fellow's head. Borthwick, have I not heard that before? Doubtless, he is a well-known bully, pimp, and brawler who hovers about the discontented lords. Is he well-born? Hell-born would be nearer truth, if rumour pedigrees him right, replies Montrose. But what aileth your majesty? He asked, perceiving the king to shudder so much that the joints of his armour rattled. Grue came over me, said the poor king, and Montrose was silent, for neither were above the superstitions of the time, and in Scotland people still believe that an involuntary shudder is caused either by a spirit passing near or when we tread upon the ground which is to be our grave. On the other hand, perhaps there was no son, and this dubious lineage is cast upon Hugh Borthwick in an attempt to blacken his name after his evil deeds. It's also reported in the following excerpt from the previously quoted from Book of Werewolves that it was a 1-year-old daughter that was saved from the fires before being made to grow up with a death sentence hanging over her head until she was old enough to join the fate of her parents and a number of her siblings. About this time, 1460, there was in Brigand ta'en with his Hale family who haunted a place in Angus. This mischievous man had in execrable fashion to take all young men and children he could steal away quietly, or tack away without knowledge, and eat them, and the younger they were esteemed them the mere tender and delicious. For the whilk cause and damnable abuse, he with his wife and bairns were all burnt, except ane young wench of a year old, who was saved and brought to Dundee, where she was brought up and fostered, and when she came to a woman's years, she was condemned and burnt quick for that crime. It is said that when she was coming to the place of execution, there gathered in huge multitude of people, especially of women, cursing her that she was so unhappy to commit so damnable deeds, to whom she turned about with an ireful countenance, saying, Wherefore chide ye with me, as if I had committed an unworthy act? Give me credence, and trow me, if ye had experience of eating men and women's flesh, you will think it so delicious that you will never forbear it again. So but any signs of repentance, this unhappy traitor died in the sight of the people. Now, the enduring fascination with the Sonny Bean and lesser-known Christy Cleek and Ian Gavelrig legends, despite their likely fictional basis, speaks to a deep-seated human interest in the macabre and the transgression of fundamental taboos. The story, with its themes of incest, brutal violence, and cannibalism, taps into primal fears and anxieties about the monster within, and the potential for extreme depravity. This fascination is not unique to Scotland. Similar tales of cannibalistic figures and families can be found in folklore and popular culture across many societies and historical periods. The lack of a factual basis for the Sonny Bean narrative underscores the power of storytelling and the human capacity to create and perpetuate narratives that explore the darker aspects of human nature and the boundaries of acceptable behaviour. Furthermore, the specific association of the cannibal legends with certain locations in Scotland, such as Sonny Bean's Cave in Girvan, illustrates how folklore can become deeply intertwined with local landscapes, even in the absence of archaeological evidence to back that up. This connection can then influence local tourism, such as at the Edinburgh Dungeons, and cultural narratives demonstrating a strong connection between myth and place. While these previously discussed Scottish cannibal legends remain firmly in the realm of folklore, the archaeological record of prehistoric Scotland offers tangible evidence of human interaction with human remains, though not always indicative of cannibalism. General archaeological discoveries across Scotland reveal a rich tapestry of prehistoric life, including hill forts, stone circles, and settlements spanning from the Mesolithic to the Iron Age. Within this broader context, specific sites have yielded human remains exhibiting modifications that warrant closer examination in relation to the possibility of cannibalism. The Loch Calder cairns in the Highland region have been the subject of osteological analysis that revealed cut marks on human bones. This is from Kelsey Yo's 2019 re-examination of the remains from Loch Calder. The passage tombs identified two cut marks on bones from Tulloch of Assery, A and B. One of these cut marks is interpreted as potentially relating to defleshing or dismemberment of the body, while the other may indicate interpersonal combat, suggesting that while modifications to human remains occurred during the Neolithic period in this region, the context points more towards mortuary practices or violence rather than consumption, especially considering that the initial interment of the bodies appears to have been as complete corpses within the chamber tombs. These findings align with the broader understanding of Neolithic funerary practices in Highland Scotland, which included diverse treatments of the dead, potentially involving defleshing or dismemberment as part of complex funerary rites. The Dunragit Bronze Age cremation cemetery in southwest Scotland has also yielded evidence of human bone modification. Analysis of the cremated remains revealed a possible sharp trauma or dismembering cut mark on one of the bone fragments. While this finding was intriguing, interpreting cut marks on cremated bone presents significant challenges due to the effects of high temperatures on bone structure, leading to shrinkage, warping, and fragmentation. This therefore makes it difficult to definitively determine the cause and timing of this potential cut mark. It could potentially be related to funerary practices prior to cremation, or it might be the result of post-mortem damage unrelated to either cannibalism or ritualistic defleshing. The Neolithic site at the Ness of Brodgar in Orkney has provided further insights into how prehistoric humans interacted with human remains. Excavations at this significant ceremonial location have uncovered fragmented human remains in various contexts, including within midden deposits, as well as being found placed intentionally beneath the foundations of structures. Notably, an adult humerus was deliberately placed under a buttress of structure 10, and a fragment of a femur was found in a kist-like box within structure 8, suggesting a ritualistic deposit rather than a typical burial. Articulated infant burials have also been discovered, with there being one instance which raised the possibility of head removal prior to interment, hinting at a specific, perhaps localized mortuary ritual. Research on Arcadian chambered cairns, such as Quaterniss and Isbister, suggests that the deliberate dismemberment of corpses may have been a practice to accelerate decomposition before the subsequent rearrangement or removal of bones, indicating complex mortuary processing. While these findings demonstrate intentional manipulation within the human remains found at the Ness of Brodgar, they are more readily interpreted within the framework of ritualistic practices involving ancestors or the symbolic use of human bones, rather than as evidence of cannibalism. Now, the Archaeology Institute on the Chambered Cairns of Orkney informs us that the disarticulated bone within these chambers led to one of the most tenacious images of the Arcadian Neolithic, that of corpses being excarnated or defleshed outside the cairn before some remains were transferred inside. Following the excavation of Quaterniss in 1972-74, excarnation was cited as the reason for a lack of smaller bones, and this arguably reached its zenith following the excavation of the Isbister cairn, South Ronaldsay. Doubt was cast on the idea of excarnation following a re-evaluation of the Quaterniss bone assemblage, which now points to whole, fully fleshed bodies being placed within the chambered cairn and left to decay, a process that may have been hastened by deliberate dismemberment. Now, evidence for conflict during the Neolithic period in Scotland comes from sites like Strathglebe Chamber Tomb, where osteological research revealed blunt force trauma to the skull of an adult male. This finding aligns with broader evidence for Neolithic conflict in the Highland region, including cut marks on a humerus and an embedded arrowhead in a vertebra from the Loch Calder cairns. While these discoveries clearly indicate violence and trauma inflicted upon individuals, again, they don't confirm cannibalism. However, such instances of violence could potentially be a precursor to post-mortem treatment of bodies that could include cannibalistic acts. Now, comparisons are always useful, and we'll get into the contextualization of potential cannibalism in prehistoric Britain and Europe. To better understand the significance of the human bone modifications found in Scotland, it is instructive to compare these findings with well-documented cases of prehistoric cannibalism in other parts of Britain and continental Europe. Gough's Cave in Somerset, England, dating to the Magdalenian period or the late Upper Paleolithic, provides compelling evidence of ritualistic cannibalism around 14,700 years ago. Archaeological analysis of human remains from the cave reveals clear signs of butchering, including cut marks indicative of disarticulation and filleting, fractures suggesting marrow extraction, and even human tooth marks. Notably, several skulls were meticulously shaped into cups or bowls, indicating potentially symbolic treatment of the deceased. The abundance of animal bones at the site suggests that this cannibalism was not driven by necessity. The early Bronze Age site of Charterhouse Warren, also in Somerset, England, presents evidence of a large-scale massacre and potential othering cannibalism, dating to approximately 4,000 years ago. The remains of at least 37 individuals, including men, women, and children, were found thrown into a deep shaft, exhibiting signs of extreme violence, including blunt force trauma to the skulls, numerous cut marks indicating dismemberment and defleshing, along with human chew marks. The presence of abundant cattle bones mixed with the human remains suggests that the cannibalism was likely not a means of sustenance, but rather a deliberate act of dehumanizing the victims, perhaps as a result of social disputes. Continental Europe has also yielded significant evidence of prehistoric cannibalism. The Neolithic site of Hexheim in Germany provides a particularly striking example of mass ritual cannibalism from around 4,500 BCE. Remains of over 500 individuals, potentially exceeding 1,000 when fully excavated, showed systematic butchering, disarticulation, and evidence of marrow extraction, with skulls cracked open and tongues removed. The presence of deliberately broken artifacts and animal bones alongside the human remains suggests a highly ritualized practice, with individuals possibly traveling from hundreds of kilometers away to participate in these ceremonies. Further evidence of cannibalism during the late Upper Paleolithic comes from Mazca Cave in Poland, dating back 18,000 years. Analysis of human bones reveal cut marks indicative of dissection and smashing for marrow extraction, potentially linked to violence or competition for resources following the last ice age. Also, Mesolithic sites in Spain have yielded human bones with cut and bite marks, suggesting instances of cannibalism around 10,000 years ago. Now, we're also given in an article from the Paisley Herald for the 4th of December 1869, a somewhat remarkable discovery of human and animal remains has been communicated by Professor Cappellini of Bologna to the Gazzetta dell'Emilia. The professor, on his return from Denmark, whether he had gone to be present at the International Prehistoric Congress, was rendered so zealous by what he had heard there that he was induced to make many excursions in the neighbourhood of Spezia. In the course of these excursions, he visited many caverns, and in one of these he was successful in discovering traces of prehistoric man. This was in a grotto in the island of Palmaria, the access to which was difficult and dangerous. Here he caused excavations to be made, and the result was the discovery of numerous flint and stone implements, the workmanship of which showed they belonged to the earliest period of the Stone Age. Besides these wrought implements and various other objects brought into the cavern by its human occupants, he found a considerable quantity of bones of animals mingled with bones of human beings. The condition of these latter bones, he says, would justify the inference that the grotto had been inhabited by anthropophagi and that the Italians of that epoch were cannibals, like their contemporaries in Belgium, France, and Denmark. Among the human bones I found those of women and part of the jawbone of a child, some 7 or 8 years of age. Some of these bones were entire, others were partially calcined. In the centre of the cave it was possible to discern traces of a fireplace. Whoever has busied himself in prehistoric researches, whoever has read Spring's excellent work on the Chevaux cavern in Belgium, and the writings of other authors on the subject of the caverns in France, will not hesitate to admit that the discoveries in the island of Palmaria prove that the Italians were, as I said, man-eaters. For the present, it will be sufficient for me to direct the attention of naturalists to the subject. The Cyclopeans spoken of in the fable were probably these cannibals. Now, one of the more accepted forms of cannibalism, though not without a huge dollop of stigma, is that done in the name of survival. We're given an interesting 18th century take on thoughts of cannibalism by those shipwrecked from the Dundee Evening Telegraph for the 8th of March 1899, entitled Cannibalism at Sea. Whenever famished shipwrecked men set foot on shore, no matter how desolate and barren may be their rock of refuge, they seem as if by magic at once to banish from their minds the very idea of anthropophagy or man-eating, and that too, though they might have been resignedly contemplating it as an imperative necessity a few hours before. In the case of Ensign Prentice of the 34th Regiment and his companion, who were wrecked on the barren island of Cape Breton in 1780, the difference between famine on shore and at sea is curiously exemplified. Prentice records that they were able to endure the most fearful pangs of hunger without ever so much as a thought of resorting to cannibalism for relief, so long, however, and only so long, as they kept on land. But when they took to their boats, and it was not once merely that they experienced this, in order to escape from their rock-bound prison, though they were not a whit worse off for food than they were on land, yet the moment they put out to sea with one accord, they began to think of killing and eating one of their number. On the other hand, when they found their attempt to escape futile and put back to shore, whenever they landed, the horrid idea of cannibalism seemed to vanish. The old Hellenic myth tells us that Antaeus, fighting with Hercules, as often as he was beaten to the ground, was filled with new strength through contact with his Mother Earth. To the fanciful, it might seem as if contact with terra firma had a not very dissimilar moral influence on the famishing mariner, filling him with fresh vigour of will to resist unnatural appetites bred of hunger pangs. But perhaps the more rational explanation may be found in the hypothesis that whilst starving men are voyaging about in an open boat, exposure to the keen sea air probably sharpens their appetite for food, and so materially increases the agony of starvation that their natural loathing for human flesh is overcome. In the Renfrewshire Independent for 18th of April 1868, we have a contemporary account of the suffering of the populace in Algeria, entitled "The Famine in Algeria: Horrible Disclosures." The Archbishop of Algiers has published a letter giving a fearful picture of the state of the colony. Typhus, he says, has set in to complete the work of starvation. In the district of Tenes, 1,500 natives have died within 29 days. At Algiers itself, upwards of 200 natives are fed by public or private charity. Anthropophagy continues at Tenes. The keeper of a mosque and his wife were reduced to such a pitch of distress that they had to feed on grass. They yielded to temptation, waylaid a travelling pedlar, smashed in his skull with a stone, and dragged his corpse to their cabin. They became regular man-eaters, and the first corpse being devoured, another traveller was murdered. Another feast of cannibals took place. In short, 5 men were thus successively killed and eaten. The cannibal couple then slaughtered and ate one of their nephews, and one of their children was also sacrificed. A little girl's cries under the knife gave alarm, and Ali Ben Kuder and his wife were arrested. They are now in custody, and the woman has confessed to the above tissue of horrors. The chambers have voted £80,000. A few of the bishops have nobly come forward, and the Temps alone of the Paris papers has got up a subscription which has produced barely £800. The stinginess contrasts in a very ugly way, says a Paris correspondent, with the munificent outlay lavished last autumn for the maintenance of the temporal power of the Pope. So survival cannibalism, driven by extreme famine, represents one possibility also for archaeological discoveries of skeletons sporting evidence of this practice. Ritualistic cannibalism, as seen at Goff's Cave and potentially Herxheim, suggests the integration of this practice into funerary rites or other symbolic activities. Violent cannibalism, exemplified by Charterhouse Warren and possibly Mashka Cave, appears linked to warfare, interpersonal conflict, or the aftermath of massacres. Firstly, symbolic cannibalism such as the othering suggested at Charterhouse Warren may have served as a means of dehumanizing enemies. The archaeological context surrounding these findings is crucial for interpretation. The presence of abundant animal bones alongside human remains can argue against survival cannibalism. The discovery of specific artifacts like skull caps can point towards ritualistic practices. Evidence of trauma and the demographic profile of the victims can offer clues about violent episodes. The comparison between the evidence from Scotland and these other sites reveals a key distinction. While cannibalism has been documented in various forms across prehistoric Britain and Europe, the context and interpretation differ significantly, indicating it was not an uniform practice. The findings from Goff's Cave suggest a structured funerary ritual, whereas those from Charterhouse Warren point to extreme violence and dehumanization. The scale of the potential ritual cannibalism at Herxheim raises questions about why similar evidence has not been found in Scotland. It could suggest different cultural norms, environmental factors, or funerary practices may have shaped how death and the dead were treated in prehistoric Scotland compared to these other regions. Interpreting the evidence or lack thereof for cannibalism in Scotland. Archaeological data to provide evidence for widespread cannibalism during Neolithic and Bronze Age Scotland remains elusive. The cut marks identified at the Loch Calder cairns are more plausibly linked to defleshing as part of mortuary rituals or to instances of interpersonal violence. The possible cut mark on cremated remains from Dunragit is difficult to interpret definitively due to the impact of cremation on the bone and could relate to pre-cremation funerary practices or post-mortem damage. The high temperatures and fragmentation involved in cremation can also obscure or destroy evidence of cut marks or other modifications that might indicate cannibalistic practices. The unusual deposits of human bones at the Ness of Brodgar, including the intentional placement of specific bones, are more likely associated with ritualistic behaviours involving ancestors or the symbolic use of human remains rather than the consumption of those remains. While evidence of conflict exists in prehistoric Scotland, such as the blunt force trauma at Strathglebe and the later violence at Swinton Kirk, these findings do not directly confirm cannibalism. While the possibility of isolated incidents of cannibalism cannot be entirely dismissed, evidence suggests that it didn't feature as a form of interaction with human remains within Scotland's history. Future research could, of course, shed more light on this interesting subject as it applies to Scotland, and we may yet find our homegrown anthropophagy. In conclusion, the legend of Sawney Bean, a gruesome tale of cannibalism in 16th century Scotland, appears to be a work of folklore, lacking substantial historical or archaeological support. In contrast to the clearer evidence of cannibalism found at sites like Goff's Cave and Charterhouse Warren in England and Herxheim in Germany, the current archaeological data from Scotland does not point towards widespread cannibalistic practices even as early as the Neolithic or Bronze Age. While cannibalism cannot, of course, be entirely ruled out in the Scottish historical record, the prevailing evidence indicates that other forms of interaction with the deceased, particularly those related to mortuary rituals and the treatment of the dead, were more prevalent. Continued archaeological research with a focus on detailed osteological analysis and thorough contextual interpretation is crucial for further uncovering of the diverse ways in which early communities in Scotland engaged with their dead. So I hope you enjoyed that rundown of cannibalism in history and its lack of evidence from within Scotland, which I guess is nice. But as we related, we can't say definitively that none took place in Scotland. I can fairly definitively state that Sawney Bean's Cave to the south of Girvan on the coast is not a cave that was inhabited by many people, if any. It's just not accommodating enough. And yeah, I would stake my life on that, in fact, not being Sawney Bean's Cave. So we may see you for the next one. Enjoy the rest of your Halloween and take care. Bye bye.